do this. Happy to be here. Hello, everyone. And I guess I'll get it started with my first question. So this is just like a really base level question for folks. I'm not sure, who's in the audience right now, but can you just talk to us about like define solar punk for us? I don't think everyone knows what that is, and it would be great to kind of ground the conversation. And maybe you could follow up with like what first drew you to this subgenre? I know you said earlier that like when you first started writing this book, you were just getting into and understanding what solar punk is.
Sure. So my current working definition of solar punk is optimistic climate fiction that champions grassroots solutions to systemic problems. And it's not always utopian, but it is looking toward better futures and better different ways to live. So I came across this term for the first time in about 2015. But I had already been thinking in that way. I've always been really interested and concerned with environmental issues, but I got really tired of dystopia and just the assumption that the future has to be bleak. And so I was looking for other ways and other visions of the future that was like, what does it look like if our future has a functioning ecosystem? What a radical idea, right? So I came across the term solar punk in 2015 through a submission call for an anthology called Wings of Renewal. And I wrote a story for that and it didn't get accepted, but it still like got me into the whole idea. And it's a genre of fiction, but it's also a movement of people that are just doing, are working toward better futures in many ways. And some of those are through artistic means, and some of them are through realistic means. And some people identify with the term solar punk, and some do not. And but we're all kind of working toward the same vision of better futures.
Yeah, that's what I found like really lovely about the community is that when I first started to learn about like the community, the movement, I first probably would have described it as a community, but I see it now more as a movement because it has all these, it's complex and it's coming from different angles. You can find like an architect in the community that is like solely focused on solar punk architecture that, may read some of the stories that are out there, but really every day they're really trying to seek out better solutions in the building space and design space. And yeah,
Mm.
that just keeps me coming back for more because I'm interested in like the different parts of the movement. So yeah. Um, well, let's talk a little bit about some of the other roles that you've played. You've worked with me. I've been so grateful for that. Folks on the line probably don't know. I think that Selena talked about this, but Serena has worked with me on a climate fiction reading contest out of Grist magazine called Imagine 2200. You've edited anthologies. You're really involved in the solar punk community. And I just wanted to know, how has this shaped your experience writing Another Life? Like all these different threads and the kind of like 360 view that you've had of the solar punk um, movement and world since you started this book.
Well, one thing in particular is so that scene that I read from is like the tour of the city scene, right? The stranger comes to town and we take a tour through the city. And reading for Imagine 2200, we had so many of those stories that were like tour of utopia, I think we nicknamed them, right? And but oftentimes that was the whole story. And so like as I was writing that scene, well, when I first wrote that scene, it was way before I'd uh, I think maybe I'd done the slush for Glass and Gardens Solar Punk Summers, but I hadn't done the Imagine 2200 yet. And so I didn't realize it was a cliche, right? Because I hadn't read all the iterations of it, but revising it and going through the edits, knowing how many writers go to that idea, I was very aware of how kind of cliche it was and the reasons that it fails sometimes. And so I had I had to work in tension to that scene. And I don't know, maybe some of that came through in the section that I read from the like her wanting to go, she's like impatient with the guy because she wants to go get her reincarnation results, right? And then there's a scene later, a little bit later on, where she encounters her political rival and she's like, we're going this direction now. So, I had to like kind of work in tension so that it's not just this like, wandering around the town and seeing how it works. But I did still want that because it's a useful way to world build. But I really learned a lot from reading all the stories in the in Imagine 2200 and in the other things that I've edited from that. So that's one thing that it definitely influenced. And I think that Solarpunk, just being involved in Solarpunk from the fiction side, has affected my life in numerous ways. And I think a lot of people come at it from the other angle. I think a lot of people, live really like eco-friendly lifestyles, or are really involved in environmental activism, things like that, and then they're bringing that into their fiction. And for me, it's kind of been the other way around. I mean, I've always been invested in environmental issues, but I think being involved with the Solarpunk fiction has made me seek out those kinds of things in real life, that I didn't even know existed before. Like solar cooking is one thing. So in the scene that I read, the characters are kind of getting their food together, but then what they do with it, they don't put it on a stove or in an oven. They carry it outside into the desert, or into the Death Valley sun, and set up these like reflective panels so that the sun does the cooking. And that's something that I actually do in my backyard here in the desert in New Mexico. And it's something that I learned about through Solarpunk, and through being involved in this. So, things like that kind of feed into my life and then back into my fiction. And,
Yeah, and I love stuff like that. Like I even reading the story, the book, I was like, you know what, maybe I should try that with my kids this summer, just as like a fun thing. I don't live in I live in Massachusetts, so the sun is in short supply, but at the same time, there's ways to like funnel the sun and kind of like amplify it with magnification or whatever. And
yeah,
just try
absolutely.
it, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but they'll like get a little science lesson out of it. And yeah, so I love that. you
You can
know,
totally do it in Massachusetts. Absolutely.
yeah, not all this stuff is like sci-fi in the sense that it's like so like you can actually do some of this. I was I'm gonna deviate from the next question just because this is prompting me to think about something we were talking about earlier, which is I think a beautiful thing about the story is that sprinkled throughout the whole story are lots of little solutions, climate solutions, adaptations, some that don't exist right now, some that do, like the solar oven. Is that what you call
Mhm.
it?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Like at first I was taking off, like counting them, and it doesn't, it feels not forced. Like it just feels like they're integrated into the fabric of everyday life in Ultra Vita. Did I say that right? All right. So yeah, I really love that component of it. And for me, that was very much like um, I love climate solution focused kind of stories that are hopeful. So this played to me. I'm your audience. Um, well, like moving along to the next question that I have. In another interview, you talked about shaving Another Life down from like a novel length down to a novella, which is what this is. How did you know that the book should be a novella? That seems complicated. And what was the editing process? Because I'm sure there's some writers that will check this out or maybe on the call. And was there any part of the original novel that was really hard to, that was hard to part with? Yeah.
Yeah, so it was originally around an 89,000 word novel, which is still kind of a short novel, but and I queried it to a couple agents and it didn't get picked up, and then I just let it sit for a couple of years. I came back to it when Stelliform Press announced their novella call, and one of the people in my critique group, who is here in the audience, Lauren Tifo, really encouraged me to submit to that open call. And I knew that Stelliform mostly had done novellas. So I was like, well, maybe I can trim it down. And then I opened up the file and like started looking at it, and I was like, this is a mess. Like, what are all these subplots? Like, there was all kinds of stuff that just didn't need to be there. There were things that were there basically to pad it out to be a novel, and subplots that just really didn't fit with the central theme and all kinds of stuff. So I, take out my virtual machete and I'm just like hacking away at it to find like, what am I actually trying to say here? What is the core of the story I'm trying to tell? And basically cut it in half when I did that. So I was like, okay, it's no problem to like have it, down to be a novella. But and yeah, and there was one subplot in particular that let's see if I can even remember. So like, so doesn't exist in the book anymore, right? So Galatia like recognizes someone who was an associate of Ramsey. So Ramsey is the bad guy that she finds out she's a reincarnation of, and she recognizes in this life one of his associates, and his role is like he's like a pharmaceutical tycoon, and it gets revealed that he's selling drugs for a pandemic that he engineered. And so post 2020, that's real cringe. That's real cringe. And I was like, I don't want that in there. We don't need to tell that story. And it just didn't fit with the rest of it either. So
Right.
that one was easy to go. The one scene that I wanted to keep that I couldn't figure out how to make work was I had a scene where Galatia goes to hang out with the Jewish community of Otravita, and they're celebrating Purim, which is a spring holiday, sometimes known as the Jewish Halloween, where everyone dresses up in costume and they drink a lot and they eat a lot of sugar and things like that. And so I had a scene where she's going to like celebrate Purim with them, and there's a character that's like feeding her wine and saying you have to drink until you don't know the difference between good and evil, and until you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordecai, and and it becomes this like not knowing the difference between Galatia and Ramsey kind of thing. And so I really loved that scene, and I really loved the sort of cultural aspects that were very personal to me. But I couldn't make it work because I had cut the things that led into that. I would have had to come up with some other reason that she was there with them, and then the plot line that led to also was connected to some of the others that I had cut. So it was like I could have made it work. I could have Frankensteined, new reasons around it, but it would have put the word count right in that awkward in between of like 50,000. That's not really a novella and not really a novel. And so ultimately I ended up just deciding that I liked that scene, but it wasn't a load-bearing wall. It could be cut, and it didn't really lose much. And there was one point in the editing when Selena was asking me to like flesh out this one interaction, where it's like the scene where I do have the Jewish character talking about the Jewish beliefs in reincarnation, and she wanted me to flesh out something about that scene, and I was like, oh, can I figure out a way to shove it back in? But it still just didn't work. So that's the one that I regret. That's the darling that I mourn.
Yeah, and the editing process is always tough. Like it's, you have to, um, yeah, this is your baby. This is what you like created, and now you have to kind of, you know, not release that stuff and get rid of it. But it's a really important part of the process, you know. And I think where you landed is a really solid story that's really tight and focused. Um, yeah, and I love that about it. Well, what about shifting gears a little? Um, we all know that solar, or many folks know, solar punk and climate fiction lean in the general direction of like technology and climate solutions, which this book has plenty of. But the thing that I really like about Another Life is that it also balances technology with like the spirituality that folks have. Like the one of the main elements of the story is reincarnation, you know, a Buddhist principle, and maybe some other religions that I'm not familiar with, but I know it from Buddhism. Um, Yet, like at the same time, the balance is there. You know, there's like because you know, like this idea that you can kind of have like this uh, kind of technology that you know can mine your genetic code to find out who you were in a past life. That's like completely technological. But I love the balance in the story. But at the same time, there's like a healthy dose, I should say, of skepticism. Um, was it difficult to maintain this balance, especially in this genre? Like, how do you feel about kind of pushing in this kind of spiritual direction? Um, you know, knowing that the genre is very much a genre that is, you know, focused on science realism, and I can't say this is totally true. You know, I know that there's, you know, snippets out there of, you know, climate fiction fantasy. I've even seen some in published some, but generally you can say that like this idea that we're climate fiction and solar punk are focus on the technological and less on kind of spirituality. How did it feel pushing and adding that layer into the story?
Yeah, that's a good and kind of complicated question. So I mean, I since I have been so involved in kind of helping shape this movement through the anthologies and all that, I have tried to push it toward more realism and toward more of being in the science fiction, which and you know for the reason that I don't want people to find hope through magical solutions, right? I want you know, I want to see realistic things that, you know, we can move toward. But at the same time, there's, you know, entertainment factor and there's also various elements to humanity. And, you know, this, you know, the spiritual aspect is an important part of being human. And one of the first books that I read that was solar punk, I didn't know it was at the time, but it absolutely is The Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk, which is a science fiction book that you can only find in the New Age section of your bookstores because it's written by a woman who's Wiccan and who has mostly published sort of nonfiction, you know, neo-paganism type things. But it is absolutely a solar punk story about a future San Francisco that's kind of a pocket utopia inside a very dystopian world. And so my aunt gave this to me, but the same aunt that taught me astrology when I was a kid gave me this book when I was like 16. And you know, I think it really shaped my worldview. And it's called The Fifth Sacred Thing because we have the four sacred things being earth, air, fire, water. And only when those are in balance can we start to address the fifth sacred thing, which is spirit. And so I think that solar punk lends itself to that kind of philosophy in the sense that, like, when we bring nature, you know, and our relationship to nature into better balance, then we can move to kind of a higher level of spiritual experience. So that's part of what is just in my worldview. And I'm a yoga instructor. Also, in addition to being a writer, I've been a yoga instructor since 2009, and I have at certain times in my life been very new agey and had, you know, beliefs that many people might ridicule. And so I'm a little bit in real life, a little bit more like the character of Nyla than like Glacia. Nyla is the character that Glacia goes to do the meditations and regressions to try to understand this reincarnation result. So yeah, I'm a little more Nyla in my real life. And I think in the beginning, I made Galatia a skeptic kind of to separate her from myself a little bit. Because when you're writing first person point of view, you know, it can be easy to slip into like a self-insert kind of thing. So there are all kinds of details about Galatia that I chose, or personality traits of hers that I chose specifically to distinguish her from myself. And that skepticism in the beginning was part of that. but then over the course of writing and revising this book, I feel like I had almost like a crisis of faith along the way. I mean, I had some really bad experiences with the yoga studio that I was working at, and just the yoga community in general, with like, you know, some big gurus being outed as abusers and things like that. And a couple of important people in my life that were seeking alternative therapies to things that they actually needed real, you know, Western treatment for. And so I became much more skeptical myself, and I think where I've personally landed is in this place of like, I still don't believe that science adequately explains everything, and especially things about you know, just the consciousness and the human condition. But I look for the sort of alternative, you know, spiritual practices that are backed by science. So like I have like breathing practices that I do, but I only do the ones that have been like scientifically studied and shown to actually affect your immune system and things like that. So I have this like, I am working toward this like balance myself. And it's probably, I'm going into all that to say that that's probably just the same way that I approached it in the book, of like, you know, that struggle that I was going through is probably part of what makes the balance in the book. And is it actually balanced? I don't know. But some people
That's
will,
really,
yeah.
yeah, I think that's really cool to hear. Like, you know, I'm sure with a lot of, I guess it depends on how many books you've written, but with a lot of writers, there's a piece of themselves in the story, and like you
Always.
explained, yeah. And so the way you just explained it, I'm like, wow, now I like it makes a different connection now. That's, thanks for sharing that with all of us. Um, well, I see there's some questions in the chat. I'm still gonna, you know, move with some of the questions I have, but then I'll transition to those questions in the chat. So I do see that there are questions, and they look pretty juicy. Um, I think we have, yeah, I do have enough time. So moving on to the next question is, what characters, or do you have a favorite character, and do you have a least favorite character in this story? Yeah, and
I one of my favorite characters is Mickey, who is just kind of this like crass, crude older woman, that is a neighbor and a friend of Galatia. She appears in some of the early scenes, and then she plays a really important role near the climax. And she's a combat veteran. She was involved in the war that Ramsey caused, and she was living on the streets when Glacia found her, or when Glacia met her. And so I don't know, I have a real soft spot for this character for some reason. And a lot of the revisions revolved around Mickey and around Mickey's role and some of her actions. And so I would, but there were certain things about her character that I just was, I held strong to, even as Selena was kind of pushing against in certain ways. So yeah, that's Mickey is one of my favorite characters. And then Tanner, who's the political rival, he's he's like 20, and he's challenging Galatia for her position as mediator. And so yeah, he's younger, he's a trans man, and Galatia is really annoyed with him through most of the book. And I love him. And um so yeah. Least favorite character, I don't think I have a least favorite character, but I will say that I did get, especially by the final revisions, there are certain sections, I don't remember exactly, but there are certain sections that I was really annoyed with Galatia, actually. Like, so the main character that,
okay,
there were a couple
like,
little times I was like, oh, God. Like, so if this were like a self-insert, character, would have made some different choices at certain parts.
completely understand that. And I love that like the characters are so themselves that like they can actually evoke that kind of emotion in you and us. And so yeah. Um, well, I hear you have another novella coming out this year. I did not know about this. This is news to me. So can you share any details with this crew that we have here?
Yes.
And are there any overlapping ideas between the next novella and Another Life?
So the new one is called Steel Tree, and it will be published by Android Press. That's the parent company that does Solarpunk magazine. So it is a science fiction retelling of the Nutcracker that pulls from both the ballet and the old E.T.A. Hoffmann story. So it takes place on another planet, but it still has a lot of solarpunk ideas. It's in like a small farming community on this new planet, and the Nutcracker himself is an android who deals with like the nut harvest, and the Sugar Plum Fairy is an alien who communicates through dance. So that should be out in December, just in time for Nutcracker season.
Nice, sounds
Mhm.
fun. Well, I'm gonna transition to these questions. So I'll start with the first one. All right, what do we got? Reading first person, EJ Condi. Huge fan of your work, Serena, and I'm very excited to read this. I have made many road trips to the Southwest US, and I found myself drawn to the Death Valley again and again. It is an enchanting place. What is your connection to Death Valley, or what inspired you to set the story there?
Good question. So I live in New Mexico, which is 2 states over from California with Death Valley, but it's still the southwestern desert. Um, so I heard about this so-called solution for rising sea levels, where the idea was to like nuke a section of northern Africa to let water go, let this ocean water go into the Qatar Depression, which is below sea level. And I was really intrigued by that idea. I think it's hugely problematic, but it was like an interesting idea to move the seawater into this below sea level desert. And so I was like, can I write a story like that? But I don't know that region of the world at all. And I really didn't want to do something with like nuclear bombs either. So I was like, okay, but Death Valley is below sea level. And I was researching like the Salton Sea, and for a little while I was like, well, maybe I can do it from the Salton Sea, and like coming up from the Baja and like crossing the border of Mexico, and there were some interesting things I could do with that. But then when I realized that I was going to tell a story about reincarnation, I was like, it has to be Death Valley. It's just thematically, it has to be Death Valley, even though like the infrastructure would be harder to get there. It's just it had to be that. And it is a really fascinating place. I have not spent a lot of time there. I did make a road trip out there fairly early on in writing this book, but I haven't spent a lot of time there. But I did a ton of research, and I spent a lot of time on Google Maps, just like envisioning, like carving out a little fictional space where Otravita might be, and like trying to get a sense of the landscape and all of that. So
Yeah, really cool. I'd never heard of that crazy experimental kind of
yeah,
thought experiment around nukes and yeah, that's
like
hugely
just to create a
problem.
channel, right? Like,
Right.
but
But yeah, Desalination getting a big play in your book, which I'm that's like a little pet, not pet, it's not a project of mine. It's just more of something, an interest of mine.
mhm.
I'm like, why don't we do more of this? I know that it's like right now super costly, but at the same time, having no water that is, is also taxing as
Right.
many people. Right. So seems like a solution to me, but what do I know? Let's go with this next question. So this question I definitely have as well, which is Otra Vita gonna show up like is there a part two? Is there like others? I know that your next story is about the Nutcracker and kind of like solar punk mashup, but do you think you'll ever pick up um, you know, other stories that are in the Ultra Vita world? Have you thought
Um,
about that?
I don't know. Right now the answer is no. But I think there's certainly potential for other stories, both with just the world building and with the reincarnation thing. So you never know. Um, but yeah, right now there's not a story that has gelled to demand my attention yet.
Gotcha. We've been kicking around this term green mirror.
Mm,
Um, and I feel like, I don't know, there's like a green mirror aspect to I guess a lot of solar punk stories, but the kind of reincarnation hologram has like a green mirror feeling to me.
yeah.
What do we got? So I'm looking at Samantha. Oh, and the last question was from Meshel. Sorry about that. I should have mentioned that. Samantha writes, I'm curious about the relationship between non-humans and humans within the book. In the scene, you read there is a person preparing a fish for cooking. Later in the book, tigers become important in a very philosophical and ethical way. I'm wondering about how this could impact the characters in Ultra Vita going forward, especially because there's so much linkage between meat production, consumption, and industrial agriculture, generally, and environmental destruction.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question and a big one. So I mean a couple times, yeah, you're right. I show a fish. The fish is from the aquaponics tanks. So there's aquaponics where the fish are fertilizing the plants, and then um, but people will also kind of cull the fish occasionally and eat them. And there are also chickens mentioned, and there's goats. I don't think they're eating the goats, but like using the goats for milk and cheese and things like that. So Otravita is not represented as like a vegan community, but I think that the relationship um to the animals is different because they're much closer to them. I mean, the chickens are there. It's not like it's a factory farm that's being slaughtered and then shipped, into the city. Like, they're, and the fish are like, you have to actually like, take it out and debone it. And, so I think the people there probably just have a closer relationship to their food, no matter what, the food is. That was something I was kind of going for with that. And that being kind of a climate solution in and of itself, of just not having these big factory farms and that are massive emitters and all that. So but yeah, there's this idea in the book that maybe animal souls are being reincarnated as humans. And so I think that has, I mean, that could be that could be a book in and of itself, I think. So I think that if that's something that the characters just kind of speculate about, it's not something that's really like proven, but I think that just the idea of it could really affect the way that people interact in with in a multi-species way, and it could certainly drive a lot more people to be vegan, probably, if that were a belief, that even if that was a possibility, right? I think that would really change the way that people think about our relationships with other creatures. So
Well, that's all we have from the audience questions. I'm about to hand it back to Selena, but I had one question that we didn't get that I wanted to get to you. We have about 2 minutes before I transition to giving the mic back to Selena. Just what's next with you? What's going on with you? I know you have the book, but what else you got going on?
I am working on a novel, and I'm not going to say too much about that, but it is solar punk, and I'm hoping to start querying that soon. So maybe something comes of that, and maybe not. Um, and yeah, and then I've non-writing wise, I've started volunteering with a rewilding project that's here in Albuquerque. That is again one of those things I might not have done if I wasn't involved in solar punk, and that's really bringing me back to life. I could say. So.
Very cool. I will hand it back to Selena. Nice chatting with you,
Thank
Serena.
you.